Well, I mean, they're talking to being a 49er next year.
Well, that's it. That's it. The 49ers want to pay him, huge lump of sum.
Well, I think for him to get that kind of money, he's really going to show up and show out this season in particular games. As opposed to padding stats. He's going to win games.
Yeah. See, the thing about Christian, he doesn't ever lose the convention, but he doesn't ever really win the convention.
Yeah.
It's like,
All right, let's do this thing. Good morning, folks. Cool. So I have 4 questions here that folks asked about. Does anyone have any other questions, or if this is your question, do you want to clarify it?
oh yeah, that was.
What's
It's more like a theoretical type question, I guess, because I wrote like a function where I'm testing, I'm basically pulling information out of a database where the target date is greater than the current date, and so when you have like an outside, source, like a current date that can change, how do you write tests that are going to pass when the current date can change, and so the state of the database is going to change?
Well, okay. So the question was, if I have a SQL table with a date column in it, and I'm, say, injecting something in there, and the default value is now, right? So now you're going to have a record in there that is now the time of when you ran your test. So how could you write a test that confirms that time, right, is your question? So you basically can just use now in your test as well. You just say, like, new date.
Yeah, that's what I did, but I'm wondering, like in the future, that test may fail because now it's because now it's not, that row no longer exists, I guess.
Well, so it depends. This answering this question depends on how you have your test suite set up. If your test suite is set up to where at the beginning of every individual test of your test suite, you empty the database, and then you inject whatever data you need in there, and then test whatever is reading that data or whatever, right? You're testing a function that reads, I'm not exactly sure which function you're testing, but let's say we're just testing a function that reads, or gives me all the records after a certain date, maybe, is the function you're testing. So you're going to, before each your test, you're going to insert, whatever, 10 rows. And then in your test, you're just going to, assert that the 2 rows that you got back were the 2 that had the date that was after now. So basically use the current time in your setup, in your injection, so that you can use the current time here.
Okay.
So it'll be the same every time because your test will run and dynamically insert now, and then you'll assert that the date you got back was within a certain relative amount of time.
Okay.
Now, one thing I've found as I've dealt with dates and testing around dates is that depending on how you're checking dates, sometimes you can take, a date is always represented in every system I've seen. A date is always represented, well, not always, but a date is sometimes represented as an integer, which representing the number of seconds from like epoch, which is like 1976, June 5th, 4 p.m. or some crazy specific date, right? So it makes it easy to store date times because we just store a big integer that represents a number of seconds, right? That's one way to store a date. Another way to store a date is just by saying like a string where you can just say like, 2017, something like this, some sort of date format that has maybe a time zone in it or something like that. That's another way to store a date. And so here's one that represents seconds or whatever. So there's all these different ways to store dates, and some of them have a different amounts of fidelity. Some of them store milliseconds, some of them don't, right? So sometimes what you'll do here is in your before each, you'll be like, okay, now is a new date object, right? And I'm going to use now when I make my 10 rows, right? But now is a JavaScript object that stores now considered that I believe includes milliseconds. Maybe not, but when we inject it into the database and then we get back our rows from whatever, right? the date on these rows, you know, whatever it is, created at or something like that, is it going to equal the now date? Maybe not. It might be off a little bit because it depends on how date and time, how you're doing your date and time comparisons, right? So it also depends on what driver you're using to connect to Postgres, right? So Postgres is going to give you back a date as just a string from directly as your response from Postgres. And then most Postgres libraries that you use are going to take that, see that it's a date type, and convert it into the native date object. And so in JavaScript, we have a date object, right? That conversion of taking a date object, putting it into SQL as a string, pulling it back out as a string, and turning it back into a date object, you need to be careful with how that's happening, because sometimes you can make your dates unequal, right? So your date currently is right now at 11:10 and 24 milliseconds. I put that in the database, and now milliseconds are gone, and I get the date back, and I recreate it, and now I have a date that represents September 7th, 11:10 a.m. and 0 milliseconds versus 11:10 a.m. and 24 milliseconds. And depending on how you compare those dates, they're not equal, right? But they're so you often, when we think about time, equality becomes a little bit fuzzy, right? We both did something at 11:10 a.m. Is that the same time? Only if we don't care about milliseconds, right? Or maybe we did it around 11 a.m. if we don't care about minutes, right? So there's a certain amount of fidelity in your checking. So I've had to write some tests sometimes where I've got these two things, they're not exactly equal, so I'm gonna check that they're within a few seconds or within a day or whatever your fidelity size is. Does that make sense?
So I have two questions. So I'm not familiar with now. Is that like
Now it's just a variable here. I'm just saying in Node here, I'm just var now equals new date is just, new date will always give you the current date and time. And so you can see there's three digits of milliseconds here.
Gotcha. So I thought it might be like a built-in object like date with JavaScript.
No, now is just a variable name. Now is not a reserved word in JavaScript. It's not a special word.
Yeah, I think that we put it in like 12 minutes.
Yes, I just was sloppily writing this pseudocode here.
Oh, okay.
My bad.
Okay.
My bad.
So how come in Node you didn't have to invoke date and yet it still worked?
That has to do with constructors. Date is a constructor. All constructors are functions. New date will actually take some arguments if you give it, right? So this is September 1st, but you can also give it no arguments, right? But a constructor, if you just put, when you use the new keyword in front of a function, it doesn't, it's the one rare case where you can invoke a function without the use of parentheses. So that will, these two things are the same. It's the same thing with, you know, if I just made any function and used it as a constructor.
That's true. I mostly use that because I've heard there's still some or at least the newest version.
I don't need to put parentheses there if you use the new keyword. But it's actually good practice to put those parens there because it is the one exception I'm aware of where you can execute a function without parentheses. So in my actual real code, I probably write new date sometimes, but this is okay to write too. Cool. All right, is that enough on dates in SQL? Sweet. All right, let's talk about these two DB things first. So who asked about setting up a DB in the terminal with PSQL?
Can you repeat that?
That was your question, right? The setting up a connection DB in terminal with PSQL. So what do you mean by setting up a connecting DB?
Database, like just connecting the database
Mhm.
with SQL.
So I'm not sure what happens on your machine, but so I have brew service. I have Postgres installed via Homebrew, and so if I do brew services list, I have a bunch of stuff, but I have Postgres running, which means if I just do PSQL, it drops me into Postgres into this database with the same name as my username. I can also give it a database name. I don't know if that's I'm not sure. Look, I even have tab completion. That's awesome. So like LG curriculum, This is the curriculum database, which has some stuff in it, right? So this is what I'm used to, is that I just run PSQL and I put a database name, and then I'm able to connect to Postgres. I'm also able to use the commands like createDB and dropDB and that kind of stuff. So that's how I would hope your machine could be set up too. What happens? Does something different happen on yours?
That part, I do get.
Okay.
It's the parts after it when you're setting up like the querying and things like that. That's what
So is your question really about how do I talk to Postgres from a
Yeah.
node script?
Yes.
Oh, okay, much different. Great. Okay. So PSQL is I thought you meant the terminal command
No.
that connects. Okay. So if you want to set up a project, I just did this yesterday, so I'll just show you what I did yesterday. Okay, here is an example of that. So in my project, I'll have a database directory. This is just how I like to set it up. The file structure you can do however you want. But I like to set up my projects to have my queries, which is reading information, be separate from my modification commands, right? So reading is idempotent, which means you can do it as often as you want, and it makes no change. It has no side effects. Whereas commands have a side effect. If you do them more than once, they're going to have more than one side effect, or they're going to have the multiple side effects, right? So that's just how I like to do it. Commands and queries stay separate. But both of them require a connection to Postgres. So here is the answer to your question. Here's an answer to your question. How do you connect to Postgres from Node? Right? So one way to do it is you get the client constructor from the PG gem. You instantiate it with a connection string, and there's actually a lot of other options you can put in here. It's all documented in the PG node package documentation. And then you have this object, you tell it to connect, and then what I'm choosing to do is just get this thing all set up and then export it. So I have a database client file that is requirable from other files that will give me an object that allows me to talk to Postgres. It's already all set up to connect to whatever database I told it to. And I have it hard-coded here, but I'm also optionally grabbing it from an environment variable. This is all optional, but basically you just need this part. You need to say, get the client from PG, instantiate a new one, tell it where the database is, tell it to connect, and now you have an object that you can say pg.query and do a select or whatever.
Okay. Yeah.
And I gave a whole lecture on this yesterday, so there's a video up that you can watch about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then once you get to this part right here,
Uh-huh.
could you just kind of read through it?
Sure. So here's a function called getUserByEmail. It takes an email. It constructs a query that uses a variable. $1 references to the first item in this array here. So this is a safe way to get our email, and we don't know what that information is. It could have come from anyone, right? So we got to be careful with it and not allow SQL injection. So we'll use this $1 variable injection system that PG provides. And so we're going to create a select query, and we're going to run that query. And if there was an error, we're just going to call our callback with the error. And if there wasn't, since this is get user singular, I'm going to put a limit 1 because we only care about the first matching record. And then when I call the callback in my successful condition, if there was no error, I should have successfully gotten back data from the database. So the rows that came back, I'm getting the first row, because that should have been the first user's table row where the email matched if there was a match. Here I'm just doing a larger SQL query that I've broken out into a string here, which also uses email. It's a little bit more complicated, but basically it's the same thing. Do this select query, use this as the email address. If there was an error, call the callback with an error. Otherwise, call it with the rows that we got back from the database. So we're building up layers, right? The bottom of this is the connection to Postgres. Then we're going to build a bunch of functions that use that connection to Postgres to do some sort of query in this file. And another file will do a command, which might be an insert or a delete or an update or some mutation. And then we're going to take a callback call the callback if there was an error, otherwise give it the data you asked for. And so now we can have a series of functions that basically wrap around queries and give you the results to those queries.
But having the commands in one file with it is not like a bad thing. It's just,
Having the commands and the queries together,
yeah.
that's fine. I just prefer to keep them separate because it helps me understand like everything in this file follows a strict pattern of read only, and everything in this file does some sort of modification. And it helps me keep those separate, but that's just a pattern that I like. You can put them all in the same file. You can put all three of the client and the queries and the commands all in one big file and just export all these functions at the bottom, and then that'll work too.
So like when we get to like phase 4 or whatever, SJ's not going to be like, why is everything in the file?
Probably, it probably would be, yeah. He probably would not want them all in the same file.
Oh, so it's good to get in the habit now. Right?
It depends on the project. It really does. This is one of those things where if you found this directory like this, follow the pattern. If you found everything in one big file, at this point when you're joining a team and you see existing patterns, even if they're not your favorite pattern or you think you could improve upon them, it's most appropriate to follow the existing pattern and have a discussion with the team about changing the pattern if you think it's worth the effort to change it, because it's that much better, right? So at some point you might work on a project where everything's in one big file and then someone wants to break it up, and so you'll agree upon some pattern and you'll break it up, or you won't. Like, so it's not there isn't right answers in this. There's just many ways to solve the same thing, and you need to start developing your own preferences as a developer, and you're going to be running into other developers with their own preferences, and y'all have to work it out. Cool.
Thanks.
Sweet. So what's a good way to target, this is all DOM stuff, to target elements of the DOM, and is there a way to target grandparent elements? And then this is just a cry for help. Who put this? Who put this? Sal, this looks like you. Okay. So I'm just going to make a static site here. Oh, actually, wrong directory. I'm going to make a static site. Why do I even have multiple desktops? And in this directory, I'm going to make an index.html and a CSS and a JS. And then I'm going to run HTTP server. And I think I might have to reinstall this. I just upgraded Node recently, so I got to reinstall my global NPM modules. Great, so this is just going to serve these static files as a static site. So we'll put some HTML in here. We'll link to our script tag. And we'll link to our CSS. And let's see if that works. So we'll just go to localhost. Sure. Hello from the static site. Yeah? Okay. So the questions are about selecting DOM elements and then binding to event handlers. So let's put a button on the page.
Vegan now? Really? Oh, wow.
Oh my God. All right, so we have a button. And it just says I have been clicked 0 times. And I'm gonna set it up so that every time you click it, it's gonna increment this thing here. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is that the first thing to know about when you're talking about accessing the DOM is that the DOM is not immediately accessible from JavaScript. There is a delay between when your JavaScript can run, the earliest point. So here's like the earliest point I can put my script. I usually put my scripts after my style sheets. So this is really the earliest point at which I would put my JavaScript. It's not super important which one here goes first, but I like to have my CSS come in quick, so I put that first. So I'm going to put my script tag up here and load as early as I can. And so if we look at the script tag here, console.log, and we'll be like index.js loaded, executed. So then we'll open the tools and we'll see that that happens, right? We see we get index.js executing. Yeah. Okay. So here I'm going to put debugger. And if we go here, check out what the DOM looks like. There's not even a body tag. Okay. And this is because when the browser processes this page, it's getting it in as a stream. It doesn't have the whole thing. It can't look ahead, right? So it gets this part, and then it gets this part, and then it gets the head, and then it gets the title, right? And then it sees this link tag, and it goes and asks for that resource, and it keeps going. This doesn't do any blocking. But when it gets to the script tag, it knows it needs to not only load this file right now, but it needs to execute it before it continues processing this HTML file. So what happens is we wait. The browser gets to this point in the HTML and it stops. It asks for this resource, and then this resource comes back from another HTTP request, and then we execute this JavaScript. And when we execute it, we're still here in the processing of the DOM. So we actually don't have access to any of these elements because we don't even know, we don't have that HTML yet. Okay? So if I were to try to do something like document query selector all, and literally just query for every single DOM node, just a star. The only DOM nodes are HTML head, title, link, and script. There's not even a body tag here. So there's definitely not a button. So if I were to do query selector all for this button, which I should have given a class name to.
So what are you doing from the JS file again?
Just logging. I'm just logging, and then I'm in the debugger. So I'm paused in the debugger at this point. Okay. So this button doesn't exist yet. So if I were to try to put something in my JavaScript where I was like, okay, document.query selector for this click counter button, this is going to come back as empty. That doesn't exist. But if I then go back and I hit play, now the page is loaded. Now the DOM is ready, and I can go, oh no, I messed it up. Maybe I need to reload because I added that class name. There we go. So now I can get that. So as soon as the DOM is ready, this button is accessible via this. So we have to wait for the DOM to be ready. And then we'll be able to select our button. So how do we do that? We're going to search for JavaScript document ready. And you will see some stuff about jQuery, but we're not using that. So let's try this second Stack Overflow. And no, that's not what I want. I want this. So this is a bit of an ambiguous answer, but let's go to see if this one has, no, okay. I like this a lot. I'll often do like minus jQuery in my Google search so I can get rid of, no, this is too complicated too. You can eliminate, yeah. This is,
You also just grab everything in a window on load.
Window on load is a different event. And I can talk about that in a second.
Document.ready minus.
This is funny because I have Google for this all the time. Okay, DOM content loaded. So this is really the real name of the event. And so this works. And I've used this a number of times. So we're going to say, we're going to add an event listener. So we're going to add that, we're going to register this function as a handler for when this thing happens. And then we'll see that we can get access to that button. So the index.js executed, then the DOM fully loaded and parsed, then we get access to the button. So that's just something you need to be aware of, is that you can execute JavaScript before the document is ready, and if you want to be, and if you want to reliably get document elements, you need to wait for the DOM to be parsed and ready. So.
You go like through like 5 to 8 bullets, so what I understand. Like,
what aren't you understanding?
The function you passed and you said that we're gonna set that to be something, and I just have so forgot. I didn't catch.
We're adding an event listener to the DOM content loaded event. So when this event happens, the browser will call this function. So it doesn't matter, you know, so then there's that view of what's going on. And then later, when the DOM's loaded, this function gets run, so this code goes.
So that means you'd have to essentially put all of your quick handler functions or whatever else you're doing within this document.add event listener.
Well, just after the DOM is loaded. So we could make, you know, a function called initialize and then just register that. That's the same thing, right? So they don't have to all be inside, but they all have to happen after, right? So I actually think it's appropriate to put an anonymous function here because we don't need to call initialize more than once. This function only needs to run once. And so DOM content, so we just inline it here. And it's nice because it gives us a local scope, right? Where we would normally do an IFI to not create global variables. We now have basically a function expression, or basically our own function scope conveniently by being in a callback anyway. So we have our own private variables, which is nice. So often my entire application or my entire JavaScript code will just look like this. Just everything's wrapped in a DOM ready. But now, if you were doing other things like loading, doing an AJAX call for some data or something, you could do that before the DOM is ready. So you only need to do this if you need access to the DOM events, or the DOM elements rather. So cool. So any other questions about waiting for the DOM to be ready?
Did you say when you're requiring, when you're linking CSS, it's the non-blocking, and when you're doing JavaScript, that's the blocking?
Yep. So this can be a potential slowdown to a page if it takes a while for this resource to load. Hopefully this resource will be cached, so all subsequent page loads, it's very quick. But maybe the first page load will be slow.
Is that why you prefer to have your style sheet before the JavaScript so it comes back?
Exactly. This loads asynchronously, so this is just going to be coming back as soon as it can. This blocks. So if this was here, we might see a little flicker before our style sheet changed the color of the page or whatever, right? So, and it's non-blocking, so like it's kind of like doing these in parallel, kind of.
Why the JavaScript parts blocking?
Because there's this use case that we don't really use anymore, where we used to be able to do. I mean, so you can do this where you can just basically write directly into the DOM as these script things are going by. So you can do things like dynamically generate content and write it to the document. So there's this phase before the DOM is ready where the document is being read and the DOM is being built, and you can use document.write to like add stuff to the DOM dynamically. It's not something that's very often used anymore. We tend to use different tools, but this is one reason why I think the script tags are blocking, is so that they can write to the DOM, and that will end up happening in the right place in the DOM. There is a way to run a script asynchronously. That's a newer feature in browsers. I think you can just come up here and do like async or something. I don't remember. But I think you can get a non-blocking script that way, but I've never needed to do that or at least never worked on a big app where I was supporting a subset of browsers that all supported asynchronous JavaScript tags. So I think that's a feature now, but there's also other ways to get around this blocking nature too. If you're really trying to hyper optimize your page load time, there's a bunch of other tricks you can do. But I just want to just the last thing I'll say about DOM ready is that you can put your script tag at the bottom, and then you don't need to wait for the DOM to be ready because it already got this part and put it in the DOM before this script tag ran. So you could do that, but I think it's important for you to know about DOM ready. So let's keep using it.
And how is this different than window.onload?
Oh yeah, window.onload waits for everything to be loaded, everything. So if you load an image or a video, it's waiting for that all to complete. So onload is like orders of magnitude longer than DOM ready, right? Because DOM ready doesn't wait for resources to be, external resources like images to be loaded. So onload is useless, basically. Okay, so how do we set up a click handler for this? So we've got our button. We're going to use add event listener for a click event. And there's a function that takes event. And we'll just log what that event looks like. So every time I click this, I get a mouse event. And it has all kinds of data on it. A bunch of stuff about where on the screen you clicked and like all kinds of interesting things. The event, one of the most important things in the event would be the event.target, which references the element that was clicked on. You might want that. But here we just need to know like when this button was clicked on. And then we're gonna use some DOM manipulation to increment this span. So let's look at this side by side. Someone clicks on this button, and then I get to be in this code here, and so I'll say, is it query selector for a child of mine? So maybe, so here, let me talk about query selector. So document.querySelector, that's how we're using to get our button, right? Query selector all would give us an array if there was more than one, but query selector will just give us the first matching element with given this CSS selector, right? So like star, that's the first element, is the HTML element, right? If I wanted the first div, we don't have any divs. If I wanted the first H1, right? So I'm just getting the first item that has the class click counter on it. Okay, and then once I have that item, I can actually use query selector again to look at items inside of that element. So now these are all the items inside of the first item with these are all the DOM nodes inside of the DOM node that has the click counter class name, right? So that's essentially what I'm doing here is I'm saying, go get the button, add an event listener. When someone clicks on it, run this function. So when someone clicks on it, look inside the click button element for an element that has button click count. So look for this span inside of you. Okay. And then we're going to set the inner text of this to +1 to what it is now. And let's see if it works. And I got nan. So why did I get nan? I don't know. So I'm going to run in the debugger here and make sure I'm getting the element I expect. So I click on this button. I'm in the debugger. I've got my count node. It's got inner text. Why is times inside of there? Oh, because this isn't a closing span tag. I messed up. So I think it'll work now. Boop, 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 boop. Yeah? Boop, 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 boop. So this works. So let's look at the code. And read through this and let me know if you have any questions.
I was going to ask about my 13 is span this year, but that makes sense because you want to keep track of that.
Yeah, I need to be able to target this text. So I wrapped it in a span, which doesn't make any style changes to it. It just gives it a targetable DOM node so that I can go grab it from the DOM and manipulate it.
And then how does that let you keep tracking of, like, how does that store and let you keep tracking of the, every time I click on it, increases?
Where's the state of this button is what you're asking, right? You said, how does this button keep track of how many times it's been clicked?
Does that mean like?
Yeah, so that's the state of the button, right?
Okay.
The state of this button could be 5 times clicked, 10 times clicked, right? And we're storing the fact that it's 10 now, and then next time will be 11, right? So we're storing that information. Where are we storing it? We are currently storing it in the DOM itself. So for example, if I click this, it increments up, right? If I just come in here and modify this to 934, boop, 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 right? And so we are finding this text span, this text node here, this count node, and we're getting the inner text, and we're converting it to a number, and then we're adding 1 to it, and we're setting that back here, right? So this is just as if we had done let n equals 0, n equals the number. So here we'll say let n equal the string 0, and now n equals the number version of n plus 1, but I'm going to manually convert it to a string here because that's what, you can't store numbers in the DOM. The DOM only stores text. And you can see that every time I run this, I'm just basically changing that string to the next number. And so I parse the string to a number, add 1, turn it back to a string. And that's essentially what's going on in here. The DOM, when I say inner text, turns this number into a string. Then the next time I click, I read that string, I turn it back to a number, and I add 1 to it. The other way to do this would be number.parseInt would be an acceptable way, or an effective way to do this as well.
And then when you refresh the page, does that also reinstate?
No, there's no state stored outside of this page. So if I refresh, it goes back to 0, yeah. Because it's stored in the DOM. The state's stored in the DOM, so you reload the page, the DOM information goes away.
Can we talk about traversing the DOM?
Yeah.
Like, where are you looking at me?
What's your question?
Okay.
So here's where we're traversing the DOM. We are saying inside the document, look for any element, look for just the first element that matches this CSS selector, right? So just like if I go into my CSS here and I put this here and I say color, dark red, background color, purple, right? That CSS selector, God, that's awful. So that CSS selector, right? This matches. We know how this works in CSS, right? We say put a class name on a thing and then style that thing, right? That makes sense. We're using the same thing to query the DOM. So we're going to say find the first element that matches the CSS selector. And that's going to get us this button here as a JavaScript DOM object. Then we want to traverse from this point in the tree down inside of ourselves. So the way we do that is we say that element dot query selector. So document represents the HTML element. So document query selector means any element in the whole document, whereas element dot query selector, or any of the other ones, query selector all, find by ID, or whatever the other ones are, right? You can traverse the DOM that way. So let's talk about traversing the DOM. Let's do a little experiment here. If I wanted this span here, what would be a CSS selector that would reference this span?
The button click count class.
The button click count class, right? So if I wanted to say document query selector, I could put this in there and I would get that span, okay? That's just for the first one. If I wanted to, so now I have this span, which is down here in the tree. It's what, 4 deep or something? I could get the button by saying parent node, I think. Parent node. I could get that thing's parent node. Someone was asking about getting all the parent nodes.
That's what I was asking, if there's maybe a different way to do it other than just constantly calling parent nodes.
Not that I'm aware of. jQuery has some really convenient methods for this. The one I'm thinking of is closest, which will basically get all of your parents and find one and let you find a parent by a selector. I don't think I don't think you can query up the tree with any methods that I'm aware of, but jQuery makes that a little bit easier.
But in vanilla, you just have to keep changing parent node if you go up multiple levels.
Yep, so this thing's a tree, right? So no matter where you find yourself in the tree, using whatever CSS selector you want, right? We can go get click counter. And then we can say child nodes, or how about child elements, I think, or just children. Children will tell you. So child nodes will also represent text nodes like this one and this one, but children doesn't. It'll only give you DOM nodes. So there's a bunch in this API. This is called the DOM API, right? So there's how you traverse the DOM is by using all these methods, but it's all a tree, right? So you can get the top of the tree just by saying document. You can get the body element by saying document.body if you want to scope your selections in there, and then do query selector for click counter, right? But no matter where you end up, you have a DOM node, and you can always look at your parent element, and you can also look at your children, and you can query down, and you can look up, and you can traverse from wherever you are to wherever you need to be, right?
A tree with no limit on how many children each node has. Each node can have like any number of.
Yeah, there's relatively no limit.
Jared, can I please remind you to repeat the question when people ask it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. What was the question that I missed? How do you traverse the DOM? It wasn't really a question. That's why I didn't repeat it. He was just like, please talk about DOM traversal. But yeah, I'm talking about DOM traversal.
So I have a question. When you changed the inner text of the button to implement it, is there a reason you changed the inner text and not the inner HTML? Because I've often noticed that those are both the same thing.
Yeah. Okay, well, so here, check it out. Document.body.inner text is the text of the page versus inner HTML is all the actual HTML, right? So if I just say inner HTML and I say, hello, let's see, I am less than you. So I can throw text in there. But if I have some potentially improperly formatted HTML, because I'm not actually injecting HTML here, I'm injecting a text string. It's not formatted, it's not appropriately formatted as HTML. So look, it interpreted less than you as some unclosed tag. If I do it like that, it puts a U tag in there, which is not even a real legal tag, right? So the thing I'm trying to get at is that unless you are injecting known good HTML, you shouldn't be injecting non-known good, right? Unknown text into your element as HTML. So inner text is not going to try to interpret this as HTML. It's going to just consider it text, and it's going to escape these special characters. So I think if we were to get the inner HTML, oh, there we go. If we just look at the inner HTML in its raw form, you'll see these less thans and greater thans have been escaped. So it's also going to escape special characters for you. So I just am in the habit of using inner text unless I know for sure that this is actual HTML with tags and stuff that's well formatted and properly escaped and all that good stuff. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I just noticed a lot of times, like when I'm targeting one specific, like when you get down to the specific button, and you look in the Chrome debugger, the inner text and inner HTML would both be like 0 or 1 or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just always use inner HTML, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
You would use inner text.
I always use inner text again, unless I'm specifically got some good HTML. Okay. So we've got some time left. I can show you more complicated examples of binding to events, but this is basically the same for all things that we bind to, right? We find the element we want to bind to, and we add an event listener. There's another thing called event delegation that we could get into, where you actually bind to it. We use event bubbling to listen for events lower in the tree on elements that are higher in the tree, and then we can respond to those events because events will bubble up the DOM tree. So we can talk about that if that's, but I'm guessing there's more questions about just this simple example of binding to a click event. Maybe not.
For that event listener on 6,
Yep.
You're using the parameter event, but you're not actually using it.
Oh yeah, that's true. I'm given an event when this function is called, and sometimes I use it, so I'm in the habit of putting it there. But like, I'm not.
For bubbling, that would probably be.
For bubbling, we're definitely going to need to look at the event to see what happened. Yeah. But for right now, we're not dealing with any of that, and so we can just. I mean, we could change it to something like this, which might be interesting and spark some questions, right? If I don't keep a copy of that. Right, I can just do something like this. I can say, go get the click element, add an event listener to it, and then I no longer have this variable, right? So I can get this DOM node by just doing event.target. And I think this will still work. So anyway, that's one less variable that I was using before. And because, like I said, when an event happens, the element it happened on is given to you as event.target, which is this element here, because that's what we listened on. Yeah. Although I wonder. Oh yeah, look at that. It works unless you click on that span, because the span is now the event.target.
Since we're here and we've got some time, can you talk about like how having a virtual DOM? Because I've heard about virtual DOMs. I don't really know what those are. Would this be like a good?
Are you talking about React's virtual DOM?
Or any other? Yeah. Why is this DOM not sufficient? What are?
It is, well, it's necessary, and React definitely uses this. But React is an alternate interface to the DOM. So this interface we're using here, where we're reading the DOM and manipulating the DOM, this is the standard DOM API. React is sort of an alternate API on top of that. That is a very, very, very different way of expressing what the DOM should be. So the reason why the virtual DOM is a big deal is because when you do stuff like this, when we query for elements and we get their inner text, or we get their, like, you know, scroll Y or something. I don't know. There's a let me get it. Let me get the actual node so I can get some text, some yeah, so you can ask things about these DOM nodes, right? You can even ask them about their style and stuff. So these nodes that you're getting, when you ask them for information, it's not as affordable as just having an object in JavaScript where you ask for its property and it gives you the value. When I say node.class list, let's see, values, is that a thing? Anyway, I want the actual class list. So here, attribute. So if I ask you about what is in your class attribute. So I got this node and I said, what's the value of the class attribute on that node, right? It has to actually go to the DOM and ask it that question and bring that answer back to JavaScript. There's some sort of bridge going on here where the actual DOM itself doesn't live in JavaScript. It's written in C in the case of Chrome, as far as I understand. It's a part of Chrome. And JavaScript just has access to ask information about the DOM. And so that bridge, whenever we make changes to the DOM or read information from the DOM, it's pretty slow compared to just vanilla JavaScript just running in its own environment, right? So it's actually pretty easy to write code that is reading and writing to and from the DOM enough to where the page starts to feel really slow and get really chunky and the frame rate drops a lot. You'll see this a lot when you have like scroll animations. And it's because we're doing too much reading and writing from the DOM. So the reason why things like React were created is because whenever you're transitioning from one state of your application to another, to get from A to B, you have to manipulate the DOM to change whatever's supposed to be changed on the screen. When we do that by hand, we tend to do very aggressive changes, like just empty out the whole thing and just fully replace it, right? And those things can be expensive. And the number of changes that have to happen, if we're doing aggressive changes, we're going to be doing a ton of expensive changes to the DOM. And so the reason why the virtual DOM is a performance optimization is because instead of looking at the DOM, which is expensive, and then doing all the commands to transition from A to B, which those are expensive, we save ourselves resources by not having to look at the DOM and see the way that it is now. What we do is we generate a virtual DOM, and then we tell the real DOM to look that way. And then the next time we need to transition from A to B, we already know what our current state is. And so we should be able to calculate what's the smallest set of changes that we need to get from A to B. And it helps us optimize using the actual DOM to transition from state A to state B. And so we're able to do this in pure JavaScript virtual DOM delta. And compile to a small list of changes to the most efficient list of real DOM changes, so that when we actually cross that DOM bridge and do those expensive operations, we're doing the minimal amount that we need to. That's why the virtual DOM is such a performance increase, is because, again, of this DOM bridge that's going on. But that abstracts away the document object model API that I'm showing you now, so much so that I think you need to spend my advice on learning to be a good web developer or optimizing your path to learning web development is to spend a lot of time using this document API and build apps that are slow or slower. You may not even notice how like these optimizations are in the millisecond range, right? You may not even notice. You might only notice when they stack up, when they stack on top of each other, and you have, your page has a lot more content or whatever, right? But understanding how this API works is going to be crucial to understanding how an API built on top of it, for example, React works, right? It's going to be not impossible, but I think harder for you to do it the other way around, where you learn React and then you discover what changes React is making under the hood to manipulate the DOM. I don't think you'll be able to fully understand what changes are on offer to you if you don't learn this DOM API, even though when we're building high performance applications and big complex single page applications, we probably want to use a reactive framework. It's probably going to be it's currently the most, in my opinion, the most like efficient way to be doing aggressive DOM changes. So if you're going to be building a single page app like Facebook or Pinterest, you want to be using a reactive library. It's going to save you a lot of logistical. There's also a lot of like data flow stuff that React does too, that tries to prevent you from making a lot of bugs that Facebook has struggled with for a long time. So there's other reasons to use React too. But I'm just saying that I think you need to dive into this built-in API before you can use an API that's on top of that. So spending time figuring out how to write figuring out how to author CSS selectors that get you the elements that you want, and how to traverse from one element up to a parent DOM node and then back down to a sibling element, and like all this DOM traversal stuff, this stuff that you want to learn, you want to be good at before you start diving into React. Now, if you want to save yourself some headaches, you could probably get a pretty good idea of all the DOM manipulation, the whole menu of DOM manipulation that you have available to you. You could probably use that and have a little bit of a smoother time if you just learn jQuery. jQuery is a bit of a nicer API than the built-in API, and jQuery is also the most popular JavaScript library of all time because it took all 20 browsers and took their different APIs and made them all the same. Right? We don't have that much of a problem now. This is pretty standardized, the stuff that I'm showing you. But jQuery will show you the kinds of things that you can do to the DOM without having to necessarily learn what is a less useful API. jQuery has a lot of what I call, or what is called, syntactic sugar. So there's things like looking at your parents instead of having to do a for loop where you walk up the parent tree and stuff like that. But this stuff is super core to being a front-end web developer, and to being able to build like awesome web interfaces. You need to know how this DOM. You need to be really comfortable with walking all around the DOM tree and manipulating specifically the little elements that you want to manipulate. So this is probably not the kind of code you're going to write in the long term, but it's really important to the learning process, I think. All right, I think we covered everything.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you.
You're welcome.